Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to be summarizing how economic conditions and policy decisions could affect the foreign exchange markets. And then last, we'll finish with how could you manipulate the value of your currency to encourage more exports. So let's get started. Okay, so the first part of this section is really just a couple of review problems. How does the economy, right, affect Forex? So it's like the economy could change and that could have an impact on Forex. And then the next part is going to be how do policies affect Forex? In other words, how could maybe the government policy affect what's going on in the Forex market? And then the last part of today is like, actually, how could you manipulate the value of your currency to benefit your net exports? And we'll come back and kind of circle back to what that means. So the first part of these is really just a review of our first lecture about Forex, but it puts it in a slightly different order. If we had, say, greater tastes and preferences for a trade partner's goods, well, that means we're going to buy more of their goods. So we would say there's a greater demand for our trade partner's goods. We would also say that there's a greater demand then for the trade partner's currency because we have to pay in the local currency. In order to buy that local currency, though, we have to supply more of our own currency. And that would lead to an appreciation of the trade partner currency and a depreciation of ours. For the second one, and I think this one's probably going to have some role in our AP test just because of how much it's been in the news lately. New tariffs or quotas on a trade partner. Well, what's that going to do to our demand for their goods? It's going to decrease. We're not going to buy as many of their goods. As a result, we don't need to buy as much of their currency, decrease demand for the trade partner's currency, and so we're not going to supply as much of our own. That'll lead to an appreciation of our currency and a depreciation of our trade partners. Third one, economic recession in trade partners' economy. So for this one, their income is going down. So are they going to buy as much from us or are they going to buy less? They're going to buy less because their income is lower. So we'll say the foreign, and just to kind of make that clear, foreign income goes down. And so that means there's going to be less demand for our stuff. They don't want to buy as much. If they're not buying as much of our stuff, they're not going to buy as much of our currency. And thus they're not going to supply their own currency because they aren't buying as much of ours. When the demand falls for their currency, demand falls for our currency, there's a depreciation of our currency's value. It goes down in price. And when they don't supply as much of theirs, their currency will go up in price. Now, the next section is about how do different government policies affect foreign exchange values. The first one here says tax cuts lead to more household income. So if there's more income, then we're going to do more spending. We're going to buy more of everything, including foreign goods. And so there's an increase in demand for trade partner goods. That means there'd be an increase in the demand for our trade partner's currency. And in order to buy that foreign currency, we have to supply more of our own. For the second one, it's related. It says tax cuts or more government spending. But either way, higher price levels, right? Price levels increase. This is really the key part. So the domestic prices are higher, so we'll buy more foreign-made goods. I want to kind of say that part again. Domestic inflation goes up, so buy more foreign stuff. I know that spelling it out like this seems really elementary, but I think it can really help you understand why these actions are happening because there's a lot of links in these chains. The higher prices are going to cause there to be a greater demand for the trade partner's goods because they're relatively cheaper than buying the stuff made at home. As a result, there's more demand for trade partner currency to buy those things with, and we have to supply our own currency into the Forex markets to get that currency. The third one is if there's a change in interest rates, and this would affect the demand for financial assets. So let's say that maybe our central bank raises interest rates, or the government borrows lots of money, and that leads to more interest rates, higher interest rates. Well, as a result, there's going to be more demand for our financial assets, capital inflows. So we would say, right, just to make sure we kind of understand, the supply of loanable funds in our market will increase because foreigners move money here, move money to here, right? To here, to us, to the domestic economy. And so that capital inflow is saying the supply of loanable funds is moving from abroad into our economy. In order to do that, they need our currency. right? They can't lend us money in their currencies. They have to lend it to us in us. So there's more demand for our currency and a greater supply of their currency. The last part on here is how do governments actually manipulate the value of their currencies? And a brief word about why. If we know that a currency that's cheaper makes their goods and services relatively cheaper, then if you were king of the world or queen of the world and you wanted to improve your GDP, to increase your net exports and GDP, you could just put your thumb on the scale and make your currency cheaper. If I make my currency cheaper, my goods and services are relatively cheaper for foreigners to buy. And so engaging in this kind of currency manipulation can really increase your exports really quickly. Imagine this scenario, right? And I'm going to write it out here. And I know this is a little bit lengthy, but I want you to be able to kind of see what that would be. Before, we'll say $1 bought 4 yuan. And the socks, we'll say one shirt that we want to buy is 2 yuan. So what would happen if an American went to China and wanted to buy shirts? Well, they would change their $1 into 4 yuan, and then they would buy 2 shirts, right? But after, let's say that the Chinese government makes their currency cheaper, $1 for 8 yuan. So now the yuan is half the price that it used to be. The dollar appreciated and buys twice as many yuan, and the yuan buys half as many dollars. As a result, one shirt is still 2 yuan. Like the factory in China doesn't change its price at all. But now America buys 4 shirts, right? 4 shirts. So imported. And so just like that, China doubled the amount of sales to the United States because by changing the ratio, they've now made it so that the shirt still costs only 2 yuan, but it's relatively cheaper for the American to purchase. And so the American buys twice as many shirts. Now, the way that they can do that, how could they make the value change like that? It's actually fairly simple. They could sell their own currency by printing lots of it and go to the foreign exchange market and say, I have tons of yuan, I want to buy US dollars. And if they buy the foreign currency, the dollars in this example, then that's going to make the dollar go up in price. And when they sell their own, it goes down in price. And so that's actually the mechanism by which you can very quickly improve your exports by manipulating the value of your currency. Now, there are some downsides, which I summarize here. There's a second method that you can also depreciate your own currency, and that's have your central bank keep interest rates really low. If your central bank keeps interest rates really low, then there's going to be very little demand for your financial assets. Foreigners won't want to supply their loanable funds into your market because they don't earn very much money. So in fact, China in the early 2000s did both of these. They kept interest rates really low, and they limited the amount that foreigners could buy of their financial assets because they wanted those foreigners to buy only their goods and services. And so they routinely would intervene in the financial markets, or the foreign exchange markets, to be clear. They would intervene in foreign exchange markets also by buying dollars and selling yuan in order to keep the value of the dollar high and the yuan really cheap to facilitate this process. So that is something that you might get a question about, right? How could you offset or fix a change in your Forex rate? You would just buy and sell currencies in order to basically change that price. Hopefully this helped you with a little bit more understanding of how Forex markets work and how they're affected by the economy and policy decisions. I'll see you next time.